Hey, Bitcoin Radio, it's your man, Joe Blackburn. Welcome to another live broadcast of WBTC, where Bitcoin lives. Bitcoin Radio, everybody. Glad to have you here listening. It's going to be a fun show. Got a very interesting character. He's going to be joining me. His name is David Morris. He's currently a staff writer at Fortune Magazine, formerly Breaker, which is something I've been paying attention to for years. And, you know, when you have somebody like this, with this credibility, with this experience, it comes with a real excitement for me. I get bubbly when I have people on like this because they've seen so much. Recently, David just released his new book. It's called Bitcoin is Magic. And I think most of us would agree with that. And he's got a great concept around this whole thing. We're going to get into that here shortly. As Bitcoin hovers around the $8,000 mark, hopefully by the time you're listening to this, it's green candles and maybe it's a lot higher. Maybe it'll show the podcast's age a little bit as you begin diving into it on your next airplane trip. But nevertheless, we're going to have some fun today. You know, I've put myself in a position like we have WCC coming up, and we have North American Bitcoin Conference coming after that. Recently, DevCon, the Ethereum conference, which David was just at. I didn't get a chance to go, but he'll have some perspectives on that as well. So stay tuned, everybody. This is gonna be a fun episode. We're gonna get into the drama. Right. And that's kind of what Bitcoin and crypto has been for a long time. I can't wait for the day that it's a little more chilled out. But anyways, all right, let's go ahead and get David on, everybody. Please make sure you send him some love after he gets done talking. I'm sure he'll appreciate having, likes and follows on people paying attention to him after this post interview. Anyways, all right, David, come on in, man. How's it going, brother? Welcome to the show.
Hey, Joe. How's it going? It's good on this end.
Dude, you've been busy, man, haven't you?
It has been a couple of weeks for sure.
Yeah, look, I'm so glad we finally got this going because I've been looking forward to this. Mostly, what excites me the most is just having your perspective, as I noted, and kind of digging in a little bit with your experience with Breaker and, now as your former employer, and then now you're with Fortune Magazine, a staff writer, man. Congratulations with the success, by the way.
Yeah, it's been a wild year. Just a year ago, I was a freelancer writing about Bitcoin for this, that, and the third publication, and now I'm big time. So it's been a journey.
It's got to be professionally rewarding, man. And, I'm sure that you run into people who either disagree with you or agree with you, but they have some conversation. I mean, anywhere you go that people know you, it's probably a pretty in-depth conversation because you make such a great, I don't want to say necessarily an argument, but a great points. And that's also, although I have not gotten a chance to read your book, Bitcoin is Magic, I'm FOMOing now that I know that it's there. It's on Amazon, everybody. We'll talk a little bit about that. But David, let's kind of take a step back, man. Let's just hear a little bit about you. Where are you at? Where are you from? How'd you get into Bitcoin?
So I'm from Texas originally. I went to UT in Austin, and then after that I went to graduate school in Iowa to study media and technology. And so I was sort of primed for this going in. I was working with people who were thinking about issues like privacy way back in 2004, 2005. So I did not wind up going into academia, becoming a professor, decided instead to go into journalism. And a couple of the first things that I wrote about for Fortune were gold, which is obviously a big topic for people who are also interested in Bitcoin. And then I'm going to hopefully get this right, in January of 2014, I was living in Florida at the time and was lucky enough to go to, you just mentioned, North American Bitcoin Conference. And I went to the January 2014 North American Bitcoin Conference, which is where Vitalik introduced Ethereum. And so I saw that. And I saw, Jesse from Kraken sitting there at a folding table promoting the idea of a Bitcoin exchange. And then I saw, all of these early figures. And a lot of this stuff is in the book, kind of what the impression was of those early advances and people with the early ideas. And some positive, some not so positive. But after that, after going to NABC in 2014, I came back to my editors at Fortune. I was just freelance at the time, but I pitched them just a laundry list of here's 12 things about cryptocurrency that I think are important and are going to be more important. And, it's 5 years later, it's absolutely stunning to see I was at this conference where I think maybe there were 800 people, probably less than that at NABC 2014. And to see the immense influence that Bitcoin and cryptocurrency more broadly have had, to the point where Facebook is launching its own crypto. Even as much as I believed in the concepts back in the day, it would have been really hard for me to look into the future and say, yes, we're going to be talking about maybe Amazon launching a coin or anything on that scale. So it's kind of mind-bending, frankly, to sit here and think about how much has happened in 5 years and where we came from.
Great points, man. And, of course, I wasn't around to be able to make it to the NABTC conference back in 2014. But man, I bet those experiences and those memories into what it looked like. And to this day, the January 2018 North American Bitcoin Conference is the most fun, most exciting conference I'd ever been to in crypto to this day. I mean, it still remains such. Now, what I personally believe makes you so qualified to have this conversation with today, David, is that you probably, have a really extensive network that exists far outside of cryptocurrency in the Bitcoin world. And as the cryptoverse goes, yeah, and the cryptoverse, we're very fond of our product, our projects, and Bitcoin itself. And you talk to somebody who's in Bitcoin and in cryptocurrencies, they're going to give you a pretty biased opinion, right? So what has your experience been from the outside looking in, as far as the people that you come in contact as a journalist? How do they perceive it? And like, obviously back in 2014, that's very different than what they would perceive it as now. And do you think we're on the right track to getting that exposure to Bitcoin that's necessary for what we consider mass adoption, which I don't know how we're not already there yet based off of the Libras and whatnot. We may already have that going for us. But anyways, to the point, where do you see this perspective from the outside, as your interactions go?
I would say I'm right on the borderline of having like an outside perspective and an insider perspective, because I do really, frankly, believe in a lot of the principles that Bitcoin was designed to promote. But I'm also just critical minded and personally have a healthy skepticism of some of the ideas that are going around. In terms of what other people think, it has been, as I said, it's been a transformative path. And, it's hard not to take some satisfaction in having been there and sort of believed at least that this was interesting, and see people flip. I mean, there has been this like dismissal for many, many years of Bitcoin is a toy, Bitcoin is a joke, it's not useful. I mean, it remains, obviously, we don't really know whether 20 years from now people will still be using Bitcoin. But I think that there's a growing sense that will be the case. I should clarify that. I think at this point it's indisputable that 20 years from now people will be using Bitcoin. Bitcoin will still be around. I think that the bigger question is, how big will it be? What sort of economic value will it have for people who are holding it right now? And how integral will it be in other elements of the financial world or just personal finance? And I think that the questions, those are still big open questions. But it has been, again, amazing to see more integration with things like Cash App now having Bitcoin purchases integrated into it, and Jack Dorsey through through Square providing support for Bitcoin. I mean, these are mainstream companies that are basically signing on to an open source project that they believe in. And I do think that there remain major problems. Obviously, things like scaling, confirmation times, those are, and I mean, Lightning is working hard to get to a point where it's usable and useful and functional, but it's still got a road ahead of it. So all of these questions of, is this actually going to be something that an average person can use? There's still a long way to go, I think. But for 5 years that I've been around, it's been an amazing amount of progress, both in public perception and in actual tools and usability and things like that.
Absolutely great points, David. And, I don't think those are even arguable. Like you nailed it there. The user interface, user experience, the UI UX that exists right now is not prepared for mass influxes of people. And we saw that in 2017. And to be honest, we haven't really gotten a lot better than 2017. I mean, things have come along, but, we had that opportunity to kind of captivate this new audience, this new money that showed up. And, people fixate on the price, obviously. And I mean, I'm guilty of this too, right? I mean, I love it when, I even mentioned the price of Bitcoin today at the start of this podcast. But, that's not the underlying desires that I personally see that Bitcoin brings. I mean, that's a reward for this transparency and this opportunity that blockchain and Bitcoin specifically bring. And it's also, an economic stabilizer. I just see so much benefit. If you're Venezuela, I would be doing everything I could to put this together on the backs of Bitcoin, right? Obviously, again, I'm biased. It's probably very skeptical for a whole government. I mean, if I was the president of Venezuela, I don't know if I would do this. I don't know if I would put or risk my credibility on the backs of Bitcoin for that matter. But I personally believe that it's going to be very successful long term. And as you noted, I also believe that 20 years from now, it should be used. But I have the principles of Bitcoin in my head as Bitcoin is store value rather than cash, right? I mean, you're not going to take gold and go spend it at the gas station. What are you going to do? Take an ounce, chip a little piece off, weigh it. No, that's how I want Bitcoin to be. I want it to be that central, not centralized, but that central store of value that we can base cryptocurrencies that like Libra maybe off of, and give credibility to other projects that are using it. Now, with that being said, let's kind of tie that into your book real quick. Bitcoin is Magic, man. You've been working on that book for some time, I'm sure, and it was recently released. Let's just get the basics.
Yeah, well, actually, I should admit that the book came together very quickly. So Breaker shut down in July, very unexpectedly. And there's a whole story behind that I can go into. But basically, I had some severance time where I was looking for my next gig, but also working on this book. And so I was able to write it really quickly. It was put together in about 3 months. And there's some downsides to that. It's got a kind of like loosey-goosey vibe to it, but I think that also hopefully makes it really readable. I'm just trying to be conversational, just kind of talking about whatever was on my mind that day, really, and went back and polished it up a little bit, but it's still probably got some rough edges, and there will probably be a second edition in a year or two, maybe. It was just a chance for me to really like vent about all these years that I've spent working in the space and what I've picked up from that time, and that hasn't been able to come out in that more journalistic form. So there's some sections about one of the big things that we worked on at Breaker, and I got to tip my hat to my colleague Corin Faith, who also did work for us there, was the problems of media in crypto. There's a lot of very corrupt and otherwise problematic media projects, and so there's a big section in the book on that. So if people are, and I think a lot of this has died down because of the ICO craze tapering off.
Sure.
But if people are interested in tips on how to evaluate your media sources, where you can get good information and where there's not such good information, there's an entire chapter in the book on that. There's some weird historical stuff, and otherwise, this concept of magic is kind of the main theme of the book.
I love it.
And the idea there, and I guess there are kind of a few different strands of the idea that come together. But one of the big ones is this idea that, if you look at magic historically, right, you think of, like witches or other forms of magical practitioners were real historical things. They existed, and I'm a materialist. I don't believe that magic is a real thing in the sense that you can like wave a wand and put some herbs in a thing and it'll produce a poof of smoke and a demon will appear. Yeah. But if you look at people who, for example, traditional healers, some of that stuff is based on real medicinal properties of things that are material, but a lot of it is based on the power of belief. And so when I say Bitcoin is magic, the general point that I'm making is that Bitcoin, like any money, is based largely on the power of the belief that people invest in it. And so the process of getting that belief up to a certain level where there's actual financial value that's derived from it is a long-term process. And it's based on communicating with other people, talking to them about the value proposition, the underlying technology. But it's also, and this is an idea that I just take largely from Murad Mammadov, who, if you haven't talked to, you should, that there's also a concept called the magic circle. And this is an idea from gaming. If you're playing a game with other people, whether it's a board game or soccer or whatever, you enter what's known as the magic circle. You establish a set of rules around how you behave, and everybody conforms to those rules, even though there are other ways that you could interact with the physical objects that are in front of you. And so by sort of pretending, in the early days, people who used Bitcoin were, to an extent, just kind of pretending that it was money. They were acting as if it were money and transacting, the infamous pizza that the Bitcoin sent to buy that are now worth like $80 million or whatever. I forget the exact numbers. That was sort of it was a game. It was play. But in that play, by entering that magic circle where people pretended that Bitcoin was money, that actually creates the cycle by which it actually becomes money. So the more people play with something as if it is real, the more it actually becomes real when you're talking about money in particular, at least. So those are kind of two of the concepts that the book explores, that, we exist in a kind of, like, a lot of parts of our lives are based on shared fantasy. All of our communication, all of our text, all of our symbolic interactions are just kind of this shared illusion that we willingly enter into. And money is a really great example
deep.
of that.
That's very deep, by the way.
I try. But money is a really powerful example of that, right? I mean, the value of the US dollar is based on a collective belief in the reality of the US dollar. If we don't all believe that the dollar has value, then the dollar doesn't have value. And the same goes for Bitcoin. And there has been this process on a couple of fronts of all of us, not all of us, but those of us who believe in Bitcoin converging on it as a store of value, and that's based on our shared belief. So that's the general overarching concept of the book.
Yeah, no, and when you just made some great analogies, by the way, and some examples there, so I can really appreciate the way that you laid that out. So I of course, we don't want to dive into the book too much where you're just telling us the book. I mean, we want to leave some Yeah, we want to leave some mystery too, though. But how's the response been so far?
Well, I'm still just kind of starting to get the response. I mean, the book I sent a few copies to maybe 20 or 30 people, and I've gotten some positive response from that. But really, not very many people have read it so far. It really,
I'm gonna read it pretty soon.
Week.
Yeah, and if you have Amazon Unlimited, you can on Kindle, you can read it. It's there right now. You can purchase it. I think it's $7 on Amazon, is what you told me.
Yeah, and that's just the ebook. I'm still working. Probably in the next couple of weeks, I'll get the print version available.
Cool.
But if you have a Kindle or a read through that, it's available now.
Absolutely. And look, if you can help me get a copy of that, I'll put it back here with. I got Samantha Radakia's a Bitcoin pizza book in the back.
Okay.
So nice. I'd be happy to display that for you.
Okay.
So moving on, David, let's talk a little bit about DEF CON, man. You just got back. You've I guess traveling the conference circuits for some time. What is your current opinion about the state of conferences for crypto?
Yeah, well, this is my first time going to DEF CON, but I definitely have gone to a ton of different conferences. To talk about DEF CON first, I think there are 2 points that I would like to make that are really interesting. First, that you just heard my spiel. It's a little bit abstract, a little bit philosophical, and I was invited to talk on the basis of an essay that I posted to Medium a while back about, which, if anybody wants a sample of the book, you can just look for my essay on Marshall McLuhan, who's a media theorist, and I wrote about how his ideas can be applied to Bitcoin. But a lot of other people were invited. There's a track at DEF CON for social science and the application of social science to understanding blockchain and cryptocurrency. And that is rare in the space so far. I think they're really getting out ahead of it. And that's, I have to applaud that hugely. And I had a great audience at the talk, and a lot of people were really interested in the ideas. So actually, to that extent, that's part of the response to the book has been really positive, because I had some good turnout at the conference and some good interaction. And I think that that's really great. And I think that it's actually very important, because like the basic point that I'm trying to make in the book, and frankly in a lot of my writing, is that you can't understand Bitcoin as an investment unless you understand it as a social phenomenon that's nested into all of these other issues around, privacy, security related issues, and the changes that are happening to society because of the way digital technology is being applied, particularly by certain governments, and governments in some places and corporations in others. It was interesting that DEF CON was in Japan. I flew in, and it was in Osaka. And one of the first things that I saw when I got off the plane from Osaka was an ad in Japan for WeChat Pay, which is one of the Chinese payment systems. And there was some discussion happening kind of at around the same time about the fact that if you go to certain places in China, I think it was Meltem Demirors that observed this, and Tony Sheng, they were both talking about this on Twitter, that you can't pay with anything other than WeChat Pay or Alipay. And those are systems that directly or indirectly have a great deal of transparency, to and controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. That should be a trend that is extremely distressing as far as how the Chinese government treats certain parts of its population. We've seen recently the impact at home in the U.S. Because of China's economic power, they're able to extend restraints on speech to other countries, which is
crazy,
terrifying. And so I think that things like that are why I and a lot of other people care about this technology and the potential for it to not just be uncensorable spending, but data management and things like that. And so that was an interesting context, especially since this is notable and might be of interest to listeners, that Japan is a very cash-based society currently. Until when I lived there about 10 years ago, and it was very hard to use even a credit card anywhere. And so
wow, and that was only, you said 10 years ago.
Yeah, 10 years ago. And that has changed a little bit. It's more it's easier to use a credit card, but it's still kind of socially unacceptable in an interesting way. It's much more common for people to use cash, and that's a thing that, whether by design or by accident, I think Japan really has
good for them, by the way.
Yeah, good stuff going for them.
Yeah.
And I think I'm gonna maybe write something about this soon, but I think that's also connected to the fact that personal debt levels in Japan are so low.
Yeah,
I think that when you're not using your credit card, you're less likely to exceed your means. So those were just context. But in terms of the conference, I think one of the interesting things about Ethereum as a community, in contrast to Bitcoin, is that, at least in the way it presents itself, it's more this like open, kind of experimental, feel-good, upbeat thing. And unfortunately, one of the things that happened at the conference kind of called that into question for me as whether that's the reality or not. I don't know if you're familiar with the CoinDesk writer Lee Keown. She wrote a piece about DEF CON on the first day that was, I don't even think critical. I think it was just for reasons that, frankly, the reasons were a little bit beyond me why it rubbed people the wrong way. But there were people in the audience for DEF CON, and even people ultimately speaking from the stage in ways that were hostile to journalists and to objective reporting on the events that were going on there.
Interesting.
And that was distressing, to say the least.
Sure.
And so I would, certainly mark that down as not a great look for Ethereum, frankly, and an embarrassment, if I can be so strong. I think that everybody in the crypto space has a lot of growing up to do in terms of how they deal with the media, how they interact with the media. But in this particular case, it was Ethereum that seemingly couldn't cope with the criticism. That's, if you can't deal with being criticized, the take home for the public is going to be that you don't actually have faith in your own project.
Sure.
And that needs to be something that people internalize. If you're lashing out, if you're being hostile, if you're saying, and there was unfortunately still anonymous person who was talking about Lee's report, who said, let's make sure that she does not feel welcome at this conference. And luckily there was a lot of pushback to that, because
Good.
That's how you end up with you were talking earlier about people in crypto kind of spending a lot of time talking to each other and looking internally. If you're alienating journalists and making them feel uncomfortable, and particularly female journalists, by the way, who deal with a lot of harassment and negativity already, it's unacceptable. And frankly, it's just going to alienate people who are not part of your community already from being curious about it or wanting to be involved in it. So that was definitely a downside of DEF CON. And I hope that, if I remember the names of the people who were saying things from the stage, dismissive of journalists, I would gladly name them right now. Unfortunately, I don't remember the names. But the people who did that should be embarrassed and should be shamed by the community, frankly.
Yeah, what surprises me the most about that, and it is distressing, as you said, because Ethereum's been in the limelight for a long time now, right? And they've gone through their ups and downs. Exactly, they should be the standard in which others should want to operate and emulate in so many ways. And if you're doing things, even if you're unhappy with maybe an article or the presentation, I want people to have a better look at it. That way that they can actually see what they're missing. Because if I believe in myself or my project, typically I'm going to say, if you've got a bad impression or a wrong impression, how do you fix that? Well, you give them
Mhm.
an opportunity to see what you're talking about. Obviously, if you're honest about how you're presenting it, et cetera, all that has to come into play. But, I mean, the public's going to find out eventually, right? And so
Mhm.
that's alarming. How did she react? How is she okay?
She's okay, but I mean, it was not easy. There was herself and another, and again, I think it's worth
Sure.
emphasizing. Her and another female journalist from CoinDesk were there, and
Man,
it
crazy.
was not fun for either of them. And I think
Yeah, I can
people need to
imagine.
understand that. I mean, this is where I'm not squishy. I mean, I don't think it should be about, oh, you hurt somebody's feelings,
Agreed. Yeah.
but
Yep.
it's worth noting that especially when people in journalism more generally feel under a lot of threat and sometimes
Hmm.
real threat in the United States, even right now, and certainly abroad. I mean, journalists get killed. So these are real issues that are not to be frankly joked about. And I mean, it was an ugly episode, truly, and should not be repeated.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I mean, if I'm somewhere and literally like because I did something, or like maybe I do a podcast and someone stands up like, "You're not welcome here, Joe Blackburn." I'm gonna be not just disappointed. You just made an enemy, friend, right?
Quite
Like
true. Yeah.
you just you know burned open the door, and you're gonna not. I mean, a journalist has a a weapon is their pen, and when you do that, I mean, Ethereum's they're gonna pay the price for this for years potentially. I mean, from
Yeah.
this particular journalist, her friends, and those who support her, and those who may not even know her but recognize the illegitimacy of treating people that way, especially
Yeah.
of the journalistic. Now I haven't. To be fair, I have not read the article. I haven't formed my own opinion on what
Yeah.
she said, but still, it sounds like that's a little bit like you said, they need
Yeah,
to grow up.
especially since Lee in particular is one of the most balanced, fair, curious, and also generally
Yep.
positive people in the space. I mean, she does some
Sure.
great investment work. She's done some great exposés on shady ICOs, but she's not there, in the way that I mean, she's not like there to find flaws in
Yeah. Exactly.
otherwise legitimate projects. She's
Sure.
curious and she's trying to learn. And I mean,
With an
I think you made
investigative
the
spirit.
yeah, exactly. And I think you made the exact point that there are long-term consequences once you've made this kind of impression on people. I should
Yeah.
say that an important thing for us as journalists to keep in mind is that this is a decentralized environment, right? Not everybody speaks for
Sure.
Ethereum as a whole, but that also makes it more risky because
Yeah.
one or two people says something hateful, and that does get applied to the entire community, whether you like it or not.
Exactly.
And so I think there needs to be some, I don't want to say self-policing. That's not what I'm talking about, but there needs to be a
Yeah.
lot more education and
For
awareness
sure.
about exactly what the role of journalists are, how to think about them, how to interact with them. Um,
That's a
and
really good point, David. And maybe we can do another segment of some sort about like that style in which people need to recognize that
yeah.
maybe they're just not familiar with. I'm sorry to interrupt. Keep going.
No, no, no. I mean, and I think it's fair to an extent. I mean, certainly this sector now, I think as a business sector, I think you'd say it's about, only about 4 or 5 years old at the most. That's enough time for people to have professionalized a little bit more
Absolutely.
than
Especially
it
Ethereum.
appears they have. Yeah. I will also, in the defense of people who have these sort of more skeptical attitudes towards the press, I think that crypto in particular has had a very dicey time because at the beginning, again, 5, 6, 7 years ago, and especially in 2017 during the ICO boom, there was a lot of genuinely corrupt media, and this is something that I go into some depth in the book. We at Breaker, again, Core and Faith, found some examples of sites taking direct bribes to publish stuff as news that was coming
Sure.
directly from companies.
Yep.
Another example that I have to harp on, with the disclosure that I work for Fortune, which is nominally a competitor, but Forbes has a very troubling business model and has for years. They have this thing called the Forbes Contributor Network. And what that essentially amounts to is people with some controls, and it has been tamped down recently, but people are basically able to go on and post on the Forbes website with no editorial oversight or very
That's crazy.
minimal editorial oversight.
I remember in 2017, the first time I heard about that, they're like, "Hey Joe, you could get a spot. It was like $7,000 or something. You know, you can go buy a spot. You can just write, a piece." And of course, I'm unaffiliated with any project, just about crypto. But I remember when I first heard about that, I said, "What? Really? Like anybody?"
Yeah. And I think it has gotten more controlled. I do think if you got a pitch where there was a monetary component involved, that might have been an intermediary. As far as I know, Forbes does not charge people for the privilege of getting on that platform. So somebody might have been trying to sell you like a package
maybe so,
to get you signed up.
I wasn't interested either way. So
but the upshot is what happens, and this is really crazy. People aren't paying for the privilege to be on there, but there are PR firms who their entire model is to contact people who are Forbes contributors and pay them to write about projects. So this is not just a source of bad information. This is actually paid coverage.
Sure.
And there's, I can't comment on whether that happens on Forbes, but there have been SEC cases filed against a platform called Seeking Alpha that you might be familiar with if you also invest in stocks. So this was a couple of years ago. There was a ring of writers and a PR firm that was paying those writers to cover their clients. And you can see the problem, because if you look at many crypto projects' websites, they will say something like, as seen in Forbes. And there is no distinction made in those cases between coverage that is coming from a Forbes contributor that does not have editorial oversight and has not had to prove the facts of anything that they're writing, and actual Forbes staffers who will genuinely write better stuff. I mean, they're real journalists.
Of course. But prior to this, Forbes has always had a pretty good reputation, when there's a Forbes article or something. But, Forbes now, I mean, they essentially in crypto, the credibility is over with, right? And real quick, I do want to clarify something. That was with a third party, and they may have had some opportunities that existed that people were able to pay to take part in. And I don't want to put that on Forbes, just to be clear.
I mean, it's terrible, but it's not that you're literally paying for it.
Exactly. So it's not on Forbes. In other words, I just want to make that very clear.
Yeah, and I mean, it's. I want to be totally fair here and make clear what the circumstances are, which is that Forbes has had a really hard time as a business itself, and this contributor network was a way for them to bridge a gap. They managed to grow really fast and sell a lot of digital advertising on the basis of this network. But I mean, they were very directly selling their credibility in exchange for views, undermining the legitimacy of information, not just about crypto, but about a lot of other stuff. And another thing that's worth mentioning that I can't remember whether I talked about this in the book or not, but you can look at the Breaker archives if you want to learn more about this. Forbes also sells franchises to independent operators around the world. So there is Forbes Middle East, there's Forbes Mexico. I'm sure there are other examples. And both Forbes Middle East and Forbes Mexico have published what appear to have been scam articles pitched to them by people who were saying things that weren't true. In the case of Forbes Middle East, this is back roughly a year ago, I think. They published a cover story with a guy who claimed to be a co-founder of Monero and had nothing to do with the project. They put him on the cover. He used that cover to go out and further scam people.
Wow.
And it's just
that is crazy.
Epic proportion. Yeah. Not only that, but after we published our report, which credit to Ricardo Spagni of Monero, he highlighted this and brought it to our attention, and we dug in and found out a little bit about this guy. The guy who was claiming to be a co-founder of Monero was actually running private pump and dump groups. That was his contribution to crypto. And
on the front cover of this magazine, Forbes,
as a crypto pioneer or visionary or whatever the hell. Can I swear on this?
Yes, you can.
Okay, because I
try not to use that F word.
Okay, well, I'll be cautious. But so we published this expose. This guy is not what he says it is. It took him 3 months to remove the story from the web. Golly. So in that 3 months, that guy was running around doing whatever he wanted, saying, "I'm a co-founder of Monero.
Yeah.
Look,
here's my resume."
So. Yeah. It's unbelievable. It is unconscionable, and Forbes should be embarrassed, and I'm sure they are. But they have to play nice with their Saudi partners, or whatever. I forget exactly the makeup of the ownership of Forbes Middle East. And it was Lee Kewen who reported a similar thing in Forbes Mexico. There was a project called doc.com that I don't want to state too strongly, but there were some questions about the legitimacy of that project, and they were featured on the cover of Forbes Mexico.
Wow. Yeah. And by the way, please, I don't know her, but please extend an invitation for Lee to come on and tell her side. I think that would be a really interesting conversation, and give her an audience that like that she's not writing for herself. That I could let her have a stage for a minute, because I think it's really, you've got to highlight those things to ensure that people recognize that, obviously assuming everything you say is been the truth, which I have no reason to question otherwise, obviously, but. I mean, I would want to help with that, because, this space takes enough crap as it is, being male dominated, being tech, being finance, being, a lot of people early on made a lot of money. They walk around, like kings and princes and queens, and, and they don't care, and they just do whatever they want to do because they have enough money and they don't have to answer to anybody, and they work for themselves, or they don't work at all. Right now, that perception of crypto is absolutely warranted. It's been that way since essentially probably 2 to 3 years after inception, and because some people have gotten very rich doing this, and it's not wrong to make money off of it, but it is wrong to do this in the wrong way, and as whether it be through scamming and and enhancing the ability for people to scam, or whether it be to censor or to eliminate somebody's opinion because you don't simply agree or like it. This is what is the problem with crypto, and you made some really good points, David, and again I'm very intrigued by your perspectives here, but let's kind of dig a little bit deeper and even say, is this something that you think is getting better, or do you think that something like this just shows and brings attention to the fact that it's not even close to better?
I think the ecosystem, like the media ecosystem, has improved a lot. The information ecosystem has improved a lot. I would say it's on a very positive trend. I think there's a lot, despite some lag, there is a degree of professionalization in how people deal with the media. Obviously, we have very ethical PR firms now, and I work with a lot of them, and I appreciate a lot of those folks. Waxman, ditto, and there's another firm that just took over the events from CoinDesk, Yap Global. These, and actually this is an interesting point in itself, which is a lot of people, including myself, I often have a lot of fun on Twitter making fun of PR firms, but they do a useful service, and part of that service is educating people about how to interact with the media, and so it's good to have them in place. This is another interesting story that from Breaker. There was a bit of a kerfuffle about an interview that I did with Charles Hoskinson, who is sort of a notorious curmudgeon, and I wrote about that a little bit. And I won't get too far into the background. He did not take it well.
I can imagine.
You can still find a YouTube video with him going on a 20-minute rant about how I'm evil and nobody should talk to me. I won't go into the background machinations, but that did not go well for him either. I think, there are lessons being learned the hard way sometimes.
Sure. And sometimes that's the way some people don't learn without touching the stove, right? I mean, it is what it is, and I mean, everybody's different, but there are some tough lessons still to be learned as well.
But I think, to your question, they are getting better because those lessons are being learned, and people are learning that, it's not just that I have power because I have this platform. What it's about is, if you don't have a free flow of information that is legitimate, the entire space loses out. I mean, information, even critical information is the only information that you can actually act on, which is what people who are running businesses need to realize, that you have that valuable insight coming from, for free from people who are pointing out problems with your project. Sure. And that should be considered valuable to you, not something that's hostile. You got to look at it long term. You're improving, you're iterating. We're still very early. And the people who actually listen to criticism and pay attention to things that they could do better are the people who are going to win the long-term race.
Yeah. And, to that point, where do you see as the highlights right now? You've been paying attention to the space at a high level. Like, what are the highlights of the Bitcoin blockchain and crypto space? I mean, like, if you had to go and, if you're running like a 1-minute ad about what crypto's done, right? I've actually thought about this question, David, and I struggle not pointing to the price of Bitcoin, right?
Right.
And ultimately, as I'm, and I don't know how much even about me, David, but we created Crypto Coin Trader, me and a few buddies, and that's a Facebook group on
Right.
about cryptocurrency, right? And now we have 116,000 people in that group, and we I consider it a brand of sorts, and it's a great community, and I'm very proud, and I love that community very much. And I've got to kind of witness these people grow up, right? But to this day, the reason most people are getting in, unless you're creating a company, you're getting in because the price of Bitcoin or some other affiliated cryptocurrency, right? To the price. Are there things that matter to people as on a day-to-day basis outside of the price of Bitcoin, or is that the allure still?
Mattering on a day-to-day basis is definitely a big question. I mean, we talk about mass adoption, mainstream adoption. I think there are two parts of the narrative that are, I think have changed productively over the last year, and one maybe just in the last few months. One is that after the ICO boom, I think that was a hard lesson for a lot of people, but an important lesson.
Sure.
That consolidated interest back into Bitcoin. I think there was a lot of expectation that there will be all these different things that happen. Utility tokens in particular have taken a beating, and maybe they're just ahead of the curve. Maybe those altcoins are going to have applications down the road. But I, on a technical and economic level, this idea of crypto economics is interesting and may wind up being valid. As much as I hate to cite this as an example, but at least theoretically, something like the BitTorrent token could be a functional utility that runs in the background of BitTorrent that actually does. I've talked to the people who designed the original version of that before Tron took it over, which is a whole other story.
Exactly. Yeah.
But the original version of that, in theory, would have actually helped speed up the BitTorrent network by helping allocate bandwidth. So things like that can work. I think that as a concept, something like storage, distributed storage.
Of course.
There are a few other applications. There's a project called Render that I don't know where it is at right now, but was certainly interesting. It was about distributed processing power for 3D modeling. I think that those are conceptually interesting. We may have been a little bit ahead of ourselves in selling those tokens.
Sure.
And it's going to take a while, if ever, for those things to catch on. And they're always going to be stuff that runs in the background. If you have any application where somebody has to manually use a particular token and pay for something actively, I don't think that's ever going to fly. I think you always are going to have an application that uses a token as a kind of trustworthy background ledger tracking your activity. So those are things that could work. Even if they're not there yet. But on a day-to-day basis, I agree that the Bitcoin price is still the main driver of interest or currently disinterest. And the second big change that I think is actually productive is in the last few months, people have started talking less and less about mass adoption and actually sort of started thinking about the idea that maybe we shouldn't be chasing that there is a smaller group of people who are really interested in the technology and most importantly, the principles behind something like Bitcoin, and that letting those people do their thing. If you can build a profitable business that makes it easier for people to be involved in that, more power to you. But I think that there's a growing idea that maybe spending our energies trying to reach beyond the people who are already interested might not be all that productive. And I know that sounds, that'll be frustrating to people who want to see Bitcoin at $50,000. But it's always been a long-term bet as an investment. And that's HODL is all about that. And when we say long-term, when we say HODL, that we're not talking about a year. We're not talking about 2 years. We're not even talking about 5 years. We may not even be talking about 10 years.
Sure.
We're talking about a really long horizon. Yep. And, if you're an active trader, Godspeed, you're taking on a lot of risk.
Yes, you are.
And the mantra that I think still holds today is, I think this is maybe less true of Bitcoin, but certainly of any other crypto asset, don't put more into it than you can afford to lose, unless you're really trying to swing for the fences.
Well, that makes too much sense. I mean, why would anybody do that, right? I mean, no, it's tried and true. If you do, you're putting yourself in a position to not just be broke, but to ruin your life. I mean, I've heard countless stories.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously there are other people who have different. I mean, we had a fight today between Joe Wiesenthal and Anthony Pompliano because Pompliano's thesis is we need to get everybody into Bitcoin right now, and he has certain reasons for thinking that way, and certainly he has a business motivation for thinking that way.
Not to mention that he's hot right now. I mean, you're not hot forever, right? He's the biggest name in crypto media, at least as far as an entertainer or a voice goes.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I should say, I believe that Anthony is a credible investor and has reasons to have. He has a well-grounded thesis for what he does. But also, maybe we need one guy like that. We don't need 500 guys like that. Because otherwise you're going to get people overextended. Ultimately, the price is a reflection of adoption and real use, whether it's people using it as a store of value or people transacting with it, which does happen. I mean, it's not an insignificant amount of traffic on the Bitcoin network now, and that's always important to emphasize.
No, and it leaves. I mean, when people I know, because I deal with cryptocurrency as a lifestyle, right? I mean, it's literally what I do for a living, and to some degree or the next. And when I have to pay somebody and I can't use crypto, it's really inconvenient for me.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm not saying it's inconvenient because I can't use it like traditionally. Of course, I can deposit in but then I still have that one barrier of crypto to fiat, right? That I have to I'm like, just take crypto. Look, let me set this up for you. You can deposit it, and they're like, no, okay, whatever.
And if you're dealing internationally, it can really be a superior solution.
Absolutely.
Peter McCormick, your competitor. I'm sorry for naming him, but
no, I'm going to have Peter on the show at some point.
I mean, it's good. It's good to have everybody kind of collaborating, but he actively uses Bitcoin to pay his contractors abroad. I mean, there are real use cases right now. It is a thing that people use. It's not just speculation anymore. Absolutely. If it ever was just speculation, but it's currently truly a useful tool, and not just for people like in Venezuela or somewhere where you have an oppressive monetary regime, something like that. I mean, there's real applications.
No, you're 100% correct, and that conversation is very hard for people to take seriously that aren't in crypto. But when you recognize early on in this, and you've been around long enough to be able to say this probably as much as anybody, but when you're talking to people who do not they don't credit Bitcoin for what it's accomplished, you can't even have a conversation with them because they're not going to change their mind until they have some sort of physical interaction with Bitcoin that shows its use case. And I'm very patient when it comes to that because I mean, Bitcoin's always proven me right. I mean, there's still unanswered questions sometimes, like, will it come back to the all-time high, right? That's a big unanswered question that I'm waiting for it to be answered. But when it does, it always does get answered. So I have a lot of faith in what it's going to do. Now, to something you were speaking about earlier, and it stands to be the I mean, people always use the chicken and the egg, comparison, the analogy, but really I like to use the analogy of the road or the car, which one really came first? Because you got to have the road for the car to be able to drive down. But why do you need roads if you don't have a car? So but it's an actual real life implemented philosophy that turned into an actual event that people had to deal with and then create, which was roads and cars at the same time, essentially. And that's where we are with crypto. In the free market nature in which the blockchain exists, somebody's going to figure it out. I have enough faith in human greed to figure this out, right? That because if there's a place to make money and be able to do it and then be sustainable, someone's going to figure it out. And also, there's a lot of use cases that we haven't even discovered that are even potentially possible, right? I mean, that's the next step of the blockchain is to open up this avenue of new tech. Anyways, but David, we'll wind it down. I know I've kept you for some time, but man, have we missed anything? Would make sure everybody knows where they can find you and where they can get your book.
Definitely check me out on Twitter. I am on there way too much, just at David Z Morris. Z as in zebra is my middle initial. The book is only on Amazon. Mixed feelings about Amazon, but they make it easy. So for right now, that's where you can find it.
Go convenience.
Just under the title, Bitcoin is Magic. And yeah, anybody who does pick it up, I would really appreciate a review. Those make a huge amount of difference if you enjoy the book. The last comment that I'll make about that, relevant to something you said, there are these people who aren't that curious about Bitcoin but have strong feelings about why it's bad. And there's a chapter in the book called The Psychopathology of Everyday No Coining, which sort of dives into some of the dimensions of the psychology of people who have this hostility towards Bitcoin. And a lot of it does have to do with the psychology also of what is money, what is reality at the broadest level, and where does value lie. And so if people are curious about maybe trying to understand that mindset a little bit more in depth, there's hopefully some insight there. So, for people who are kind of looking to encourage adoption, or at least encouraging people to have open minds about some of this stuff, there's maybe something useful there in looking at where people are coming from when they're so irrationally hostile.
Absolutely. That's a great point, David. I'm glad you said that. I say this something you're going to hear me say it here shortly when we wind this down and close the podcast. But I say something like, it's the cryptoverse. It's ours. It belongs to us. It's our job to take care of it. And I've kind of adjusted that, and I say it different ways at different times. But I know what I'm doing for the cryptoverse right now. David, you're clearly doing something. You're doing your part. But the average person, they may sit there and they don't take that seriously at times. And I've even been asked, well, I'm not a developer, and nor I just buy it and hold it. Like that's my contribution. I'm like, well, that's great. And I appreciate your hold, as long as you're not selling over and over again, we can be friends. But what you can do though, is you can learn and understand how to present this information properly, to understand and how to present, Bitcoin in a way that not only makes sense, but it also is not aggressive. You don't have to. I understand why people didn't want to buy Bitcoin or don't want to buy Bitcoin, because that was me at one point, right? At some point, I didn't create Bitcoin and I didn't buy it the first day that it came out. Most of it was because of the lack of knowledge that it even existed. But I didn't even get it the first time someone explained it to me. So, I understand why. Now, anyways, but yes, I thought that you said that very well.
And there's a point that I have to make, which is, reading. Just read. If you're a Bitcoin person, just continue reading, continue to be curious. It is complicated. It's infinitely complicated. It's never-endingly complicated. Those of us who make our living thinking about this stuff have stuff that we don't know. But the interesting contrast is I'm not going to name him because I don't want to seem like a troll, but there's a fairly notorious guy who is now a BSV supporter and who tweeted a while back that he doesn't read books. And I think that's not a coincidence, That's
not a coincidence. You're right.
If you're not a critical thinker, you're going to fall for anything. So keep that in mind too. There are still, if you want to branch out beyond Bitcoin, there still are scams out there. And so the more you educate yourself about the basics of the technology and the reasons that it's important, the less likely you are to get ripped off.
Absolutely.
So think about it as self-defense, not just community promotion.
Dude, absolutely. I hope people take that advice and they take it very seriously, because it's instrumental in the success of this space that we have people who are successful as well. And you can only arm yourself. No one else is looking out for you. And if they do, they're not going to look out for you forever. All right. So at the end of each podcast, David, I do this thing. It's called a Quickfire. I did not preface you for this, and I apologize, but I'd like to ask some questions about you, and they may or may not be relevant to the conversation we just had, but they're fun. They're lighthearted. Feel free to pass. You don't have to answer anything, obviously. And I might be a little bit aggravated if you pass, but that's a joke, obviously.
I'm an open book, so
cool. So I start off with the same question for the most part, and it's my favorite. And there's humans been around for 250,000 years or so. Roundabout, who knows? But that's what carbon dating has allowed us to at least assume is educated guess on the time period. And of that time period, obviously the galaxy and the universe are much older than that. But have you believed at any point, or do you believe currently, that aliens have ever visited planet Earth while humans have been around?
Oh, that's an interesting twist on that question.
It can be both, but.
Yeah, no, I guess I would have to say no on visiting while humans were around. I actually don't believe that.
Fair.
But on the more conventional element of the question, I think there's a pretty high chance that there are other forms of intelligent life out there.
Sure. Yeah. And the reason why I ask it the way I do is because there is no way for us to know if aliens passed by during the dinosaur days, right? That was 65 million years ago. If they were that advanced back then, they've surpassed the interest in us, or if they're not extinct, Anyways, I appreciate your answer. I think it's good. All right. So moving on. Next question is favorite movie or best movie of all time. And you can name a couple if you need to.
I'm just going to go off the top of my head here with some like a recent movie that is one of the greatest that I've ever seen is Mandy with Nicolas Cage. That is absolutely mind blowing horror movie that highly recommended.
Yeah, don't spoil it. I've been looking for something to watch.
Best movie of all time, I'll pass. I'm not an authority, but it's at least a pick. It's a recommendation.
Okay, fair. All right. So next question, a little bit more deep, I guess, and personal is biggest influence in crypto for you? Biggest influence in crypto? Blockchain.
I have to give a lot of credit to Andreas Antonopoulos, who was really one of the first guys who, I haven't followed his work beat by beat, but he brought a level of intellectual rigor to thinking about Bitcoin. I mean, he was one of my sources back when I first started writing about this stuff in 2014. So he was way ahead of the curve in just thinking about it in a careful way. And I think that, whether people have read everything he's written or not, I think the space owes him a long-term debt of gratitude.
Yeah, if I had to pick somebody to speak for us, it would be him. I think that's well said and a great answer. Okay, so the last couple are pretty simple, but yes or no's are fine. But if you want to expand on them, feel free to. And we'll start with Bitcoin as a political party. Yes or no?
Yes. And I think for better and for worse, right? I actually, one of the things that I talk about in the book, and, maybe there's a chance to revisit this later, but, I'm not always completely comfortable with the libertarian ethos that seems to come out of Bitcoin and that has been kind of the standard for it. And frankly, I don't think that it actually is synonymous with the impacts of Bitcoin. Sure. I think that you can do a lot more with uncensorable money than just be a hyper individualist. And I think that, so if Bitcoin is a political party, it's a lot more complicated than people might believe. I am certainly an anti-authoritarian, but I am not a libertarian. And you can, that's a position that is available. You don't have to be all about being an individual in order to have skepticism towards power. And so if there's a Bitcoin political party, I hope that it is not just a sort of right-wing libertarian party, but something that bridges divides. And that actually has been my experience.
And mine too.
Yeah, I productively interact with people who I disagree with politically all the time, but there are shared underlying values around, independence. Freedom is not a concept that is owned by the conservative wing of politics, which can sometimes seem like what it is in the United States. And so I think that has been, I think that Bitcoin can serve as a microcosm of a potential future politics that is not oriented around the left-right divides that we have now. And so from that perspective, yes, Bitcoin as a political party, I'm in favor of it.
I agree.
But it needs to expand the definition of what it is.
Of course, yeah. And that's why I keep it simple, just because I don't think that there's a answer or even a way to describe, what that would look like at this point. Right. We are very, I don't want to say divided in Bitcoin, but, we're as divided as any other, I guess, entity. But I do feel like because there is that unification under the flag of Bitcoin, it does allow conversation and acceptance and a diversified outlook on potential outcomes of where you might be one day, right? I think it just keeps people open-minded to, hey, look, we're doing this together. And I mean, I'm from the South, and I tend to lean conservative, especially fiscally, but I do consider myself libertarian in principle, but I want government in my life. Nobody hates good government. It's only bad government that sucks, right? I mean, when you got good government, you don't have to worry about it. And so I want good government. I'm impartial when it comes to, political parties. I don't believe in either one of them or that they stand for, half the population and the other half of the population disagrees with everything. We agree on so many things, even as individuals on different sides of the aisle. We just don't have to talk about those or argue, and nobody clicks on things that we agree on. So the media has. Yeah, the media has a large responsibility going forward, I think, especially if you're in politics, to enunciate the state, I think, of this country better. It's a weird way to say it.
This is getting off into non-Bitcoin topics, but I think that it's emblematic of, Bitcoin has a lot of people asking questions that haven't been asked in a long time about money and politics, and how the government has a role in money. And I think, we're in a very exciting moment right now where people are asking questions that haven't been asked about politics in a long time. And, for better or
Well
worse,
said.
we've had a decade of just wild upending of the conventional wisdom in every way. And so, Bitcoin is a political party, certainly. Bitcoin as a kind of intellectual movement, though, as well, is very valuable
Absolutely.
because people are exploring things and people are asking questions, and
Yep.
we're being challenged in what we took for granted for a long time.
For sure. Actually, I believe that idea that would be a precursor to a political party. Obviously, I think that you're in between that, and would be the bridge to something along those lines. But anyways, a great answer, and I appreciate your thoughts on that. Okay, last question. You ready?
Okay.
Bitcoin, can it be $1 million?
$1 million per Bitcoin.
Per Bitcoin.
I would have to do some math that I'm not prepared to do right now.
Fine, yeah.
But I think it's probably a stretch. Except that when you denominate it in dollars, right? There's a question of what's the dollar base that you're going to be dealing with. So if you have a huge expansion in the dollar base, but I think that to answer a slightly different question, there's this idea of hyper Bitcoinization, that we're going to perhaps transition to an economy where Bitcoin is everything, and that might be a part of how you get to a Bitcoin that's worth $1 million, or one scenario. And I frankly don't believe that that's a likely scenario. You were talking about good government, right? And I'm also from the South, I'm from Texas, and I'm more of a progressive, but I am an outlier in being more pro-gun progressive than I think a lot of people on that side are, and for similar reasons, right? Bitcoin is a check. It's not necessarily a replacement for government money, which I think a lot of people have believed for a long time, but it is a check on the abuses of government, in the same way that the good Texan in me does still believe that putting guns in the hands of average people is, you're not going to necessarily go against the U.S. Army if that happens to happen, but it's the fact that it is what it is,
an underlying consequence.
Constraint,
Absolutely.
And so if we're talking about hyper Bitcoinization, I don't see that as a likely future scenario. Bitcoin is going to be one form of currency among many. So if that's the implicit question, I have to say no Bitcoin $1 million.
No, great answer. And personally speaking, it can't. I always say it like this: can it? I mean, it could, I guess, right? It would. For Bitcoin to end up as $1 million, though, I'll say that we would have to deal with some really tragic and horrible circumstances prior to that wouldn't make it worth it to see Bitcoin as $1 million one day.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, if we have total social collapse, Bitcoin could be, the only money. So anything's possible.
I'm not looking forward to that. Yeah, no, exactly. Great answers though, David. And look, I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. I hope that you've had as much fun, and hope that you'll come back and visit with me sometime.
Yeah, great. Absolutely. This has been good.
Absolutely, man. Okay, well, Bitcoin Radio, give it up for David. Make sure that you follow him, support him, buy his book, check him out. I know that if you're like me, you've enjoyed this conversation, and I hope to have some more of them. David, once again, man, thank you so much. Tell the kitty I said
if you're hearing a sound, this is the boy.
Hey, I love it. Look at them eyes. Wow, beautiful.
Yeah, he's a freak.
Hey, who isn't, right? Anyways, all right, until next time, Bitcoin Radio, this is WBTC, where Bitcoin lives. Take care of the cryptoverse. It belongs to us, and we'll see you soon.